Welcome, everyone. This is John McElwain from the NonProfit Times. Our webinar today is on 5 ways your nonprofit can beat inflation. This is a topic upmost in everyone's mind as the demand for nonprofit services is steadily increasing, widening the gap between societal needs and the resources available from government and business. Meanwhile, even though nonprofits understand the value of omnichannel fundraising, their core direct mail channel is being subjected to labor and materials costs of increases ranging from 15 to 20% this year alone. We're fortunate to have 2 subject matter experts discuss how leading nonprofits are mitigating the effects of inflation and the recession, including tools such as behavioral economics modeling, advanced artificial intelligence services to improve giving levels, sustain participation rates, and lower the cost per dollar raised. Our panel today hosts Michael Gorriarán, president of Arjuna Solutions, who is joined by their Chief Technology Officer, Rachel Michele. Rachel brings a unique blend of technical, managerial, and executive experience in support of product development, AI, process automation, data visualization, infrastructure, strategic planning, and forecasting. Prior to joining Arjuna, Rachel led a forensic data analytics team as a manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Her team was deployed in response to some of the largest cyber breaches, financial crimes, and regulatory investigations in U.S. history, routinely requiring them to parse through billions of records across disparate databases and data sets. Their work resulted in identifying and apprehending hackers behind the largest financial services breaches at the time. She has also led multidisciplinary teams on projects concerning matters of U.S. security and has researched, developed, and changed the way forensic sciences visually represent data sets to enhance decision-making process. How does someone with that kind of vast experience relax? Rachel enjoys traveling and exploring the world with her husband and 2 boys. Michael has led Arjuna for over 4 years. He brings more than 30 years of experience at Microsoft, Xerox, and Advanced Technical Solutions and Services. He has held global leadership roles in the U.S., Europe, and Latin America. He also served as former chair of the Oregon Council of Hispanic Advertisers, a 501c3. A few housekeeping details. Today's session is being recorded and will be available with slides following the conclusion of today's presentation. Go to npttimes.com/webinars. You may ask questions of today's speakers by using the question box found on your screen. To begin our session today, Michael.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the intro. We're delighted to be here with you today. We're calling in today from the sunny city of Chicago. So we're on the road, actually. So I apologize for the background, but this is what we're dealing with today. So I just wanted to welcome you all to the conference. And we're delighted to have Rachel with us, as was mentioned. Rachel is actually in Israel right now. So we have a multi-country thing going on here during the webinar. So we're talking a little bit about how you can beat inflation with artificial intelligence and behavioral economics modeling services. So the backgrounds have already been covered, so I'm going to skip through that. I'll give you a quick bio on our business. So our business is a decisions as a service business. So even though we have behavioral economics modeling as our core capability, we deliver it with our artificial intelligence services, and we provide that to our clients as a service. And you'll hear more about what the services are. We have found that that is the most successful model in providing this type of advanced service to nonprofit organizations over the last 5 years, because when we worked a lot with clients that didn't have data scientists on staff and people that would be able to work with these types of services firsthand, and they were using us quite extensively as a second level support resource or primary capability of delivering on a monthly basis the services. So we decided to go in this direction as delivering it as a service 5 years ago. The business was founded in 2013. We received patents for the behavioral economics modeling that you'll hear about shortly, and that was in 2014. And we've had those inactive with clients, or actively serving clients, for the last 4 years from 2018 forward. And we do direct response fundraising support. So the artificial intelligence solutions you'll hear about today, behavioral economics modeling capabilities, is all going to be correlated directly to direct response fundraising. And we support giving optimization from $5 to $10,000 while lowering the cost per dollar raised. You'll hear about different AI models to achieve both of those accomplishments, improving giving while lowering the cost per dollar raised. So we have run almost 10 billion records through the system since 2018, and we've influenced more than $100 million in donations with the systems. We typically start out with clients in small pilots, and then we expand from there as the justification to do so economically makes sense. So the 100 million is expanding exponentially right now because the clients that have started working with us over the last 3 and 4 years are adopting greater and greater use of our services with each year's budget. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is how you can use AI to improve net proceeds, and I'm hoping this concept resonates with you, especially with inflation. I want to talk a little about optimizing donor lifetime value, personalizing the relationship investment decision. So not just having relationships without economic consideration, but considering both simultaneously, and how you can do that with AI. And then the next one I wanted to speak about is finding the new value in lapsed donors, the lapsed donor file. So as you're working with your lapsed donors and trying to determine whom to reactivate, in an inflationary environment, that selection process is especially important, given the cost of the direct mail response phenomenon right now, the influence of inflation in that particular file. And then the last piece is measuring fundraising performance. I want to talk a little bit about some best practices in measuring. So our first poll question is now, and I'll turn it over to Rachel for handling the poll.
All right, so first question, is your organization feeling the impact of inflation? And give you some options here. First one, no, what's inflation? No, not yet, see it coming. Yes, it is becoming an increasing issue. And yes, it hurts. So please answer one of the following for, is your organization feeling the impact of inflation? And Daryl, when you see the responses come in, if you could put up the answers as well. Thank you. Okay, so definitely, as we see with the clients in our portfolio, see it coming or it hurts or on the way. So I think you guys will find what we're about to work through very relevant to you.
So, 89% of you are seeing some aspect of inflation. When I talk with our clients regularly, what I'm seeing is things like this. The headlines are driving a phenomenally different experience for donors. And as a result of that, especially below $100 in annual giving, donor behavior is fundamentally changing. And we saw this in the fourth quarter of last year because we do sentiment modeling. The behavioral economics models we create for donors are based on donor sentiment. And we saw this happening. We didn't understand it when we first saw it, but we saw the effect on giving taking place back in the fourth quarter of last year, starting in around September, October timeframe. And I don't know about you, but I think the first thing we saw was not just inflation. It's almost been a double whammy of kind of challenging environment for fundraising, with inflation being the second wave. The first wave we saw was really the post-COVID-19 vaccination phase, where at least in my family, once we were all vaccinated, we said, okay, now we're going to start reliving life, right? And we started doing restaurants instead of eating at home all the time. And we were now started buying clothes. So, we didn't get a new car, but I would like to get a new car. But we were out there kind of experiencing life again with some sort of entertainment and travel. And so as a result of that, when we went into the fourth quarter last year, the ability to give the same amount to the same number of organizations was a little bit diminished, because all of a sudden our discretionary income was being consumed, as it hadn't been during COVID, in doing things that we had not been doing during COVID. So as a result of that, we started to see this fluctuation, especially with donors who were giving gifts below $100. And what was happening is, the way we experienced it was that we had a lack of elasticity. And so it was diminished elasticity to a lack of elasticity. And what that means basically is, if you were giving below $75, that you were giving less frequently and not at the same rate as prior years. Normally, when we work with a client, what we have is a phenomenon of experiencing around a 12% average improvement in giving in the first year of using our services. And what we saw all of a sudden is we were getting 4%, 5% lift. And in that phenomenon, we said, well, why is this a monthly situation, or why is that happening in the fourth quarter, which is the best giving time of the year? And we didn't really realize what we were seeing at that moment until we then saw the second wave of inflation hitting, where all of a sudden you saw that lack of elasticity being diminished further as we started getting into February, March, April timeframe. So it was an interesting thing for us to see, and I'll talk with you a little bit more about how to handle that situation in this presentation. The next piece we saw was fundraising costs themselves have gone up. For the clients that we deal with, the average that I'm hearing across them is between 15 and 20%, with the highest one that I've seen at 22%. It's the combination of paper cost, envelopes, postage, and interestingly enough, freight has been extremely high among these variables, exceeding 20% readily. And the last one, labor, of course. If you were turning over labor in the environment to actually do the work that fulfillment houses, printing houses, and even in-house does in fundraising, was going up a lot. So then a lot of people say, well, let me switch my direct mail cost over to digital because that's free, because the concept is free. Now, I worked my entire career, 35 years at Microsoft and Xerox, and there's no such thing as a free infrastructure. The idea is you have to build the infrastructure, and as you build it out, and not just have the core infrastructure in place, but start adding more applications, as we all see with the new CRM and marketing automation systems, the platforms become more and more expensive. But if you use them excessively, you have donors disengaging or disregarding your solicitations. So the idea is to get the right number of solicitations, whether it's direct mail or in this case digitally, going to donors with the right cadence in terms of the whether it's monthly or weekly or daily, getting that right, and at the same time securing the right dollar amount or making sure you have the right dollar amount in those solicitations. So the idea that by going to digital, you're going to decrease cost is not true, because the more you use it, the more the donors disengage. And the last one is we saw a phenomenally good improvement in episodic giving, but we all know you can't build a nonprofit in episodic giving. You have to be able to have sustained giving. It may be an episode that drives an on-ramp for donors, but if you're in a situation where that becomes your core donor, you can't renew them, then you end up being in a negative spiral because you're spending more and more and more to acquire donors as a result of natural phenomenons like the situation in Ukraine or social issues that are being reflected in court settlements or court decisions, natural disasters, things like that. So we saw, at least on our end with all of our clients, and we serve some of the largest nonprofits in the industry, is they had fewer donors providing smaller gifts in the last 8 months, 9 months this year. And that when we factored in the impact of inflation, they had net negative growth in terms of improvements in fundraising year over year. And the idea is, how do you use the improvements in net proceeds from the use of artificial intelligence and behavioral economics modeling to be able to drive improvements in nonprofit fundraising? And what I wanted to land on right now is this idea of net proceeds, because a lot of my clients historically, when we've spoken with them, it's been about lift, improvements in fundraising, more dollars, but the sensitivity on the cost side was not as high as it is now. Obviously, this is what we have to focus on. So when we think about the next poll, before I jump into this, I'll turn it over to Rachel. Let's see how you're feeling about the cost side and net proceeds. And I specifically want to figure out a particular question that's germane to this presentation. Rachel?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. For this next question, pick all that apply. How do you determine the ask for each donor? Do you use MRC HPC with some multiple? Do you use both capacity? Do you use a segment of one personalization or something else? So again, check all that apply. How do you determine the ask amount for each of your donors? And Daryl, when you think ready, please show us the answers. So I think, Michael, this is pretty consistent with our portfolio where it's across the board, and I'm sure a number of you selected more than one depending on what kind of appeal you send. We see that a lot, but I think this fits with what we've seen.
We'd love to hear what is in the other, because that's fascinating to have 30% in the other. So if you want to share those in the chat or in some capacity during the webinar, I'd love to see what the other is. The one we see the most frequently is the MRC or HBC plus some times some multiple. That's the one we see the most. But what I wanted to talk with you a little bit right now is improving net proceeds. So as I mentioned, it's not just about raising money, but it's keeping the cost down. So if I think about net proceeds, it's a simple formula of what's the average gift, how many donors are you able to provide, the gift, and then what is the cost of solicitation. So subtracting out the cost of solicitations. And when we look at that in behavioral economics modeling, we think about 3 types of results on the numerator, if you will, and trying to get those donors to provide higher average gifts. Is we focus on an enhancement in annual giving, optimizing a lifetime value, and then advancing donors across the donor segments. They're all correlated to each other, but they have different types of modeling associated with them that allow you to have these trigger points in place so that as you are looking at donor sentiment and you're determining how much to ask of them, we focus on ensuring that we get the right amount in place with the donor that is optimized over a lifetime of giving, not just a one-time extraction, and that we're advancing donors faster across the different segments of giving. Our results in this area are typically 12% on the left in enhancement and 11% on the right in terms of moving donors faster across the donor segments while optimizing the lifetime of giving. And that's what this behavioral economics modeling, we call it BEMAI, as you see on the slide here, is what we deliver to clients as a service. We have seen that this conversion of donor sentiment into the ask array values has been particularly critical in this particular juncture, where we see people being materially affected by inflation, and we see all kinds of sensitivity around giving levels that are fluctuating month to month to month. So we are calculating this on a month-to-month basis. On the bottom side of the equation, we're optimizing solicitation costs. And there's 2 aspects of this. One is we're determining whom should be solicited. So we get the sentiment, we convert it into a dollar amount for that particular month, and then we convert it into a secondary question. That secondary question is a service called Exact Donor, and it tells you whether or not that donor should be receiving a solicitation that month. And if not, then you set it aside, and you don't go in and put all the volume into the email, because this is the second part of it, is we balance across the channels and making sure that the volume is intact across those 2. The third leg of that stool is the marketing volume, is advancing your cause by telling the great stories that you do. And if you can talk to us about the volume and cadence of your marketing information, the volume and cadence of your email, the volume and cadence of your direct mail, we can give you an equation that looks like this, and this equation drives net proceeds. So an important concept to manage in this era that is different than it was even a year ago. So in summary, in that first point, one way of beating artificial intelligence is using this particular type of sentiment modeling to be able to drive net proceeds by improving giving while lowering the cost per dollar raised. You're also, by not excessively soliciting, preserving your brand equity. So the next point out of the 5 points I'd like to land today is to optimize donor lifetime value. So the first key for us is always to retain donors first, and then know precisely how much to ask of them, and advance donors across the giving levels that I've been mentioning. So improving giving levels, the problem right now is inherent in the structure of the way fundraising is done, is it's usually done in a direct response format by using echelons of pricing. And we don't care if it's 3 or if it's 5 or if it's 3, 4, 5, 6 numbers that are used in the gift string. But the idea is to make sure that these gift strings are personalized. So inherently speaking, when you have 3 levels like this, which we see this to be the most in the industry, is 3 levels of asks, and then we have an other for any amount the donor wishes to provide. Inherently speaking, this is sub-optimized because the area between these particular levels is 25% of unfound or unrealized revenue. So by using behavioral economics modeling and this particular type of AI that is associated with driving those models to individual donors, we find where the donor actually sits on the demand curve. And we start building an economic model that has 2 facets to it. One is it's only pertinent to your organization. And the second one, it's only pertinent to your relationship with that donor at that specific moment in time. So once we find them, and we tend to run these about every 30 days for our clients and keep refreshing the ask amounts. Once we find the donor, we build the ask arrays or the ask string around where they are in the demand curve. And so instead of having something broad like this that could be 100, 250, 500, and I have many illustrations of that, we don't alienate the donor by starting them at 100 when the donor is sitting over here. Or if we start at 100 and the next one is 250 and the donor was here, maybe they drop down to the lower ask. These are typical human behaviors that we see in giving. By finding a customized gift array and landing it specifically, they tend to pay more quickly, and they will provide you a gift at the value that's being suggested, which we know is the economic point of equilibrium between how they feel about the organization and what their annual giving and lifetime giving looks like. So this is the problem we're solving with this particular type of behavioral economics modeling. So we think about alternatives. Major giving requires a major giving officer, and the beauty of that particular skill set is they know the donor deeply, they understand their motivation, and they know how much to ask and when to ask, because it's a cultivation process. We are trying to mimic that process, maybe not with the same level of precision as the intuition of human being, of course, but because we are trying to mimic that process with machine learning, we look for the cues that are correlated directly to giving in terms of both amount and the time to solicit. What we compete against actually is this area right here, which is the broad giving segments where people use RFM. So it's a model, not a company we're competing with, is using recency, frequency, and monetary value to segment donors, and then having some multiple against either the previous gift or an average of 3 years of giving or the highest previous contribution. This is very standard stuff we see across the industry. And then they take that number and multiply it by 1, 1.5, and 2. We see that a lot. We see some simple forms of AI that is just really an advanced form of regression analysis to project the next gift. Not that great. This is actually better than that. But we have intellectual property and patents in this area. So this is the only organization that provides this type of capability where you're doing a behavioral economic model for each individual donor. And it's only in the context of that particular organization at that moment in time. And we use it only with the information that is available about that donor within your organization. There's no third-party data. There's no work around looking at where a donor has given elsewhere. So with us, what you're getting is dynamic personalization at scale. We're literally building one-to-one models between your donor and you and updating them monthly with the signals from the donor about their interest in making a gift. We look at this as an omni-channel solution, and the ideal state for us is having all channels activated with the correct gift arrays for those channels. However, I will tell you that we spend most of our time in direct mail because it is reliable, predictable, responsive, and you can do a lot of great machine learning modeling off of it. The area that we complement direct mail with in the first pivot is email. And then obviously there is online registered user. As long as we know who they are, they log in for that renewal donation, we can surface the correct gift array, or telemarketing, SMS, text. There's other channels that we can solicit the donors through. But giving the donor a nicely harmonized experience, so when they get the solicitation, this is a direct mail example, but like I said, could be digital as well, is we want to be able to give them an experience that when they see this particular solution, this solicitation, that instead of seeing some broad amounts like this is from the University of Oregon, my wife's alma mater, where we donate to, they put a broad gift array values from 1,000 down to 750 and then 500 and 300. And they do a nice job of personalizing it up top where it says, Dear Michael and Christina. But then when you look at that gift array, the string there, I should say, the string is so wide that it looks like a fishing expedition. So they go from the personalization and really making that intimate request of calling us by first names, showing us where we've given in the past, and then all of a sudden the train comes off the rails with the ask string because it's so broad. So if I look at a client that has been successful using us, which is Medical Assistance Programs International MAP, they basically, and I love about this, it's brand compliant. We give them the ask arrays and they convert it directly into the fulfillment of their charter. So if you think about their cause is helping people in impoverished communities or disaster afflicted communities where they need medicines and medical products, this is their breathing campaign for albuterol and nebulizer. And what it says basically is give us whatever we predict, say it's $110, and you can help 11 children breathe. And they make that kind of conversion for the customized ask amount to the customized direct impact that you will make with that gift. It's very, very good direct response marketing. And if I look at what's happening under the background here, is when we set our engagements in place and we start measuring results that I've been talking about, some of the lift and the response rate retention and advancing donors. The way we do this is we start out with a small pilot, and this is especially important today with inflation affecting everybody. Everybody wanted to see how this works in an inflationary environment, which I'll show you some examples from case studies in a few minutes. So what we do is we set up a pilot, and Rachel's group is the one that manages that. Rachel manages all of the technology and technology development, technology services for the company. And what we do is we look in this particular case about the gray line being a control group in simple A/B testing, and the blue line being the Arjuna solution that we're putting in place. We have a few services, we pick the one that's appropriate for the customer. But the point is to make this equitable. So $68 in the single gift over here, and that's the control group, a single gift average, standard deviation of about $94 here. For the control group, you see the treatment group at $69 for the average single gift, and then the standard deviation of $96.91. So as we look at the impact here, what's happening is we're not changing the number of donors that are participating. Remember, I've said retention a few times. That's really paramount to the success of these services, retention first. Then what's happening is looking carefully at each donor and determining who has a higher affinity right now to be able to ask of a little bit higher amount. Now, in some cases, we will ask for less to retain the donor as well. But in this case, the pool generated an improvement right over here that you can see visually, and that translates into $142,000. This is about a year long that they realized this small part of the file because it was a pilot, and they paid around $55,000 to $60,000 is in that range for the $142,000. So what you're seeing here in the green box is we're shifting the standard deviation from 96 to 112. And by doing that, finding those donors, we're flattening out the demand curve and flattening out the distribution curve and finding those who have the passion and interest to give more. So this is not about capacity. This is finding that sentiment and translating it. And Rachel, I know you're very keen on this. Why don't you cover this particular slide for us, please?
Yeah, so one of the number one questions that comes up after seeing the slide that Michael just walked through is that they understand the shift, but they want to understand really in a quantified way, did that impact the number of donors behind it? And we're always looking at different ways to slice the data to express retention and change in dollar amount. So what we see is the average donation amount on the left side, and you can see over time, prior to the line where the pilot started, it's even, and where Michael has circled, you can see that the average gift has dramatically increased above the control line. At the same time, the active donor count was balanced before, and it's actually staying the same. So this is the perfect sort of view that we look at in our pilots to impact the amount and maintain retention.
So if we look at this also in another perspective, I love this this particular chart came out of Rachel's group, is when we look at clients, we want to make sure that as you're getting a lift and you're getting the retention of the donor, how does that look by donor segment? Because the elasticity, as I mentioned a couple of times, is different by donor segment. What we always look for as we break out by donor segment is the blue line ahead of the white line. Now on the bottom, we get to 500 to 999. Nobody wants to see a lower gift, but as I've mentioned a couple of times, retention is first and the gift value is second. So you can see that we actually had a lower gift amount for $50 less. But by measuring the sentiment correctly, we knew relatively how much to ask to secure that gift again. Whereas on the control treatment, they ended up, the control group, I should say, they ended up having $100 decrease in the gift for that particular category. And it gets worse in the higher categories. The one that's the most dramatic is this over 2,500. As I mentioned earlier, we work in direct response marketing up to $10,000 in giving. So you see this over $2,500 category, and the donors here, while we were down 1,000, we still secured the gift. The control group was down almost 3,300, it looks like. So the idea is we're really cutting the donor experience into finite segments and making sure that we understand the elasticity, response rate, gift size by donor segment as we look at this kind of modeling. This is a couple of customers we've blended together just for anonymity purposes. This is right through the teeth of inflation over the last few months here, and we started seeing 2022's economy evolve. But we started looking at machine learning and sentiment modeling to determine what is the right amount to ask. And we have to have a that typically occurs about 3 learning rounds in, if you will. It's about 60 days per learning round, where we're looking at responses from donors to educate us on their sentiment and then determine how much to ask. And when I look at this, you say, wow, you know, this is not a lot of money. It's only a 2% lift, 3% lift, 4% lift. That 4% lift for 2 of our clients translates into more than $1 million improvement. So it is quite a bit of money when you look at the volume that's involved, and you also look at the lack of elasticity that exists, especially most of these gifts in this particular file are on the lower side, you know, below $100. And so if you can get this kind of lift, even in the teeth of inflation, it shows you that there is some numerator management that you can still do on the improved giving to be able to survive through inflation. This particular segment I'm showing you right here was precisely 795,000 when we took this cut of data. And what's most important about it is not only how much you raised, but how much money you kept. And so if you think about the return on investment for projects that you normally fund, this is the equivalent of getting $3.33 back for every dollar invested. So that return on investment is 233% or 223%. And so that was a nice net gain for these 2 clients in a short period of time, a few months here, to be able to drive toward either getting back on budget, which is a nice thing to be on budget, the original budget projected, or to be able to invest in other projects that you feel are priorities for fundraising. So in summary, it's retention in that segment, in optimizing donors, obviously, but know how much precisely to ask, advanced donors across the segments. And then the next piece is about personalizing the decision on investing in the relationship to keep donors cultivated properly. So we look at optimizing the solicitation cadence scale, the cadence model, while reducing the cost per dollar raised, and then at the same time preserving brand equity. So Rachel, I love this slide when you figured this out. Rachel's team does all the analytics. I love this material. Do you want to cover this for us?
Sure. So what we're looking at here is a classification of donors by how much they respond to a solicitation in an annual view. And if you think about just the statistics of responding, the portfolio view that we're looking at here has a 93.9% solicitations that actually produce $0. So in effect, that just means you have a 6% response rate. What's interesting about this is that almost 70% of those solicitations, 69.8, were sent to individuals that actually never responded during this period. Especially interesting because this is a renewal file. And so what we do in this analysis is we classify the donors, and you'll see the first one is the dark gray. These are the people who just did not respond during this period. The white section, I think, Michael, if you click through to the next one, is individuals who gave 1 gift during this section, during this time period. And the green is donors who gave more than once. So what we do in our modeling is look for donors with a high degree of empathy. We try to find these people and associate their degree of empathy with an action to take. So are they going to drop off? Don't spend the time or the money soliciting these people. The people in the 1 gift response, find the optimal amount that gets that gift and maintains the brand equity, but doesn't over solicit them. And for the multiple gift responses, find the balance and appeal to maximize your giving levels here.
And when Rachel came up with this and we started introducing it to clients, the no gift response category, we are quickly trying to reduce, not eliminate the solicitations. So she has a fail-safe measure in it where if they're not showing an indication of responding, then she puts them in a slower and slower cadence to determine if there's any kind of gift and winds it down to save that money. It's a good portfolio view of things.
And in the case of reduction, it usually amounts to about 10 to 30%. And as Michael said, we have checks and balances to make sure that if we don't solicit someone this month, there are times to check them in subsequent months to make sure that that the donor is still engaged in some way. So what's interesting is if you look at a different perspective on the same data, what we're looking at here is reinforcing the point of brand equity. And in this chart, it shows the donation amount given versus the average time solicited in a year. And you can see that it actually, the amount goes down the more times you solicit them. And so this sweet spot where the circle is showing that there is an optimal view that is less than what's happening right now. And so what the behavioral economics modeling does is it shows the right time to solicit the right person and reduce the total number of solicitations while maintaining retention and also optimizing brand equity.
And as you've seen these slides, these are from our customers. So these are real data from customers. This is a combination of two customers that have this particular dramatic phenomenon that we selected to show you the real way in which their donors respond. So if I go a little forward from here, then this is a view of the economics of doing this. So when you think about determining whether or not to make that investment in the relationship through a direct mail response and the cost of doing that, then what we look at is if there was no reduction, you just simply are running at the same volume, you basically have this for your cost right here, 500,000 in this particular example. This is a reflection of a model you'll see in a second. And I know that cost is not linear reduction, but as you start grooming across a cost and figuring out how much to use each month, usually you end up in a very economically advantageous situation because you're retaining donors while spending less money. So the revenue prediction or revenue realization in this particular model for this client is $1,250, $1,250,000, and the cost was $500,000 to get there. Their net proceeds of where they ended up was $750,000. And we do this service, or we provide this service every month, which is determining whether or not to solicit the donor and how much to ask them. So the whether or not in this particular case to solicit them ended up being about a 30% reduction for this particular month. Some months it could be 0, some months it could be 5. They're not round numbers. I'm just giving you numbers as a range to illustrate the point. But in this particular place, it's about 30% reduction. So then what happens is when you reduce 30% of the volume, in this case, they've saved $150,000. And if I look at the gross stayed nearly the same. It's immaterial. So then what happens is the net proceeds go up to almost $900,000. So you're basically gaining an incremental $147,500 in this particular model with these clients to be able to reinvest against other projects that you think are another priority, or just simply cut it out of your budget. So it's retention of both donors, retention of the dollar value while lowering the cost per dollar raised. And the tool that Rachel invented with her team looks like this. So when we deliver the service back, if we were running an experiment, for instance, where there were 100,000 people in the control group, 100,000 people in the treatment group, so typical A/B testing, if we took the 100,000 names that we were supposed to calculate an ask amount for, that service is called Exact Ask. We then run that information through Exact Donor, and Exact Donor tells us, secondary service, whether or not we should be asking them for a donation at this moment in time. And as I mentioned earlier, if we're looking at your marketing correspondence and your fundraising correspondence at the same time, it provides even more insight about donor behavior. But in this particular case, our team, we provide this as a service internally, we look at this and we determine what is the best economic situation. So for the 100,000 names that you've asked us to project a dollar value for, we come back and say, actually, it should be these 30%, these individuals should come out this month, and you're still going to get the amount that was shown in the prior slide. So you net up 147,000 by reducing the cost associated with doing that. So in this case, you end up with an ROI of 181%, which is basically 147,000, roughly $150,000 gain for $50,000 in expense. And so this becomes a very critical thing with inflation when you have out of budget increases that are substantial and fundraising that's being depressed. So in summary, we would suggest that by using this behavioral economics modeling services, you can know what the optimal cadence is for each donor each month, and that allows you to sustain brand equity while reducing the cost per dollar raised. So what I wanted to talk about now is the lapsed campaign, because this is the other area. And why this is so important is in an inflationary environment where it costs much more to be able to solicit someone, it's really important to know whom to solicit. So when I talk about lapse, I specifically mean lapsed of 25 months to 59 months. And then beyond that, it's almost like reacquisition. Below that, it's an active donor. So when we think about the lapsed model, what we normally see is that there are two approaches to determining whom to solicit in the lapsed file. One is, let's just mail everyone, right? And that is not necessarily an economically advantageous model, because basically you're spending an excessive amount of money for a very limited return, especially if the average dollar value of the gifts are below $50. And if the response rate is below 3%, the economics are just not there to justify the logic of just mailing every single person in the lapse file. The better idea is to determine what is the budget for the lapse file, and we can work with you on both budget and cadence, which is optimizing the way in which the lapse file is re-engaged. But we normally see that the lapse file is a game of playing less than half the file if you're going to get an economic advantage of how to solicit them. And the models that we see being used are the recency model, which means let's get the people who gave in month 25, 26, et cetera, you all know better than I. And the recency model basically looks like this. The donor behavior is a good number of gifts, but actually a small dollar value. And as you go deeper into the recency model, the actual gifts and participation rates start to wane, and the model generates a decent amount of activity, but not very high gifts. And what that looks like on the right here, and I'm trying to see how I can move this off my slide here. I'm trying to move the, I'm not going to do that. I was trying to move the right side of my slide. I can't see. So anyways, let me see if I drag it. Sorry about this. There we go. I'm going to try that. There we go. Okay. The control panel was blocking me there. So anyways, the recency model looks like this, where response rate is high and donor lifetime is not that good. They don't stay around that long. They just provide that renewing gift. And then the retention rate as a result of that is not that high. And the average gift amount is slightly good, but not extremely favorable. The other model that we see is, there we go, is the propensity one. The example I always use is a museum, for instance, where your family is going to the museum a lot. You visit it 4 times during the year. You have a high affinity to it. As they ask you for that second appeal, special appeal second gift, then you see donors that actually provide a second gift at a relatively high rate compared to the recency model. But the number of people that fit that profile is limited. And you can run them side by side if you want to. We do some recency, some propensity. But at the end of the day, the inherent limitations in these models cause them to be suboptimal in giving. So what Rachel did with her team was she invented this other technology that is called Exact Donor I've been speaking about. And what it does is it finds this little piece of giving outside of the norm, and it allows you to gain a substantial amount because you're bringing in the donors that have the highest economic potential. And so what that looks, if I look at the models on the right here, so it looks like this. We have a high donor lifetime value, we have a high retention rate, and we get that nice thing, which is optimizing life while being in a situation where you get the highest possible gift. The rates of improvement we get by doing this is about 35%, and that's conservative because we're picking the best donors to reactivate. So Rachel, why don't you take this one?
As Michael was saying, when we think about the lapsed file, it's not about mailing everybody. It's about picking the people with the highest economic potential. And this is especially right now important with everything going on with inflation. And so what we're able to do is think about lapse selection as a percentage of your entire lapsed file. And with a pretty moderate set of assumptions that you see on the right side of the slide, we modeled out if you selected the top X% of your lapsed file using different models, what would that look like as far as revenue? And far and away, we see that the exact donor selection method is able to better select the people with that economic potential. And just selecting or just looking at this 35% of the pool. As an example, highlighted in blue in the table, you can see that the revenue value comes out at about 1.5 times that of the recency model, 1.44 times the value of propensity. So it's just a different way of looking things to find the potential in the lapsed file.
So like I mentioned earlier, in the inflationary environment, it's really important to have tools like this to be able to get into a situation where you can optimize the returns from the lapsed file solicitation. And net acquiring a new donor is like 5 times more expensive than keeping the existing donor. We all know these kind of heuristics. So it's really great when somebody has been a donor to try to reactivate them, but do it with the ones that are the most likely to make the gift and the most likely to make the exceptional gift or the larger gift. So if we, there we go. If we think about this in summary, basically, that's the opportunity to find new sources of value at exceptional levels of revenue production out of the lapsed file, while making sure that you're not excessively soliciting people. And I see people with lapsed files where the cadence is monthly even, or 6 times a year. And we're suggesting is we know when to do that and we know whom to ask. So you get the benefit of both sides. So the last thing I want to talk about basically is measuring performance, which we want to do holistically, objectively, and transparently. And what I find is there are some unusual aspects of the nonprofit sector that we all know about, which is who is funding the ride and do they get credit for the experience, right? And so when we look at some of the direct attribution models, when you think about making a behavioral economic model and using AI to do that for each donor, the idea is to cultivate the relationship with the donor, and the donor then responds with gifts through multiple channels. But if you constrain the results that come out of the direct mail channel to only those that are attributable to the channel, then what you're looking at is a picture of doing something with this where the economic gain is certainly better, but it's not actually representing the impact against the full cause when people are actually looking at all of the indirect attribution as well, the gifts that come through all the different channels and the ways donors engage, making. These are actually mutually exclusive sets of data. So if you're looking at something on the left-hand side of the slide here, you're looking at only a piece of the picture. If you look on the right, you see the other piece of the picture right here. And then that piece of the picture, when you combine these two together, gives you a phenomenal opportunity to advance the cause in ways that other technologies cannot provide. But the important thing is not to look at the channel and not to look at the campaign, but to look at how the donor is moving. And that's usually the only thing we report on is retention, optimization, and lowering the cost of sustaining those relationships when it's logical and possible. And one of the things about this is knowing basically the budgeting process. So Rachel, if I'm curious about how people do budgeting before I dive into this budgeting methodology.
Yes, me too. So if you guys could just select one this time. Does your organization use zero-based budgeting? And choose from always, sometimes, seldom, or never on if your organization uses zero-based budgeting. And Daryl, when ready, I'm so curious about this one.
Okay, what do we have here? Ever, okay, good. All right, so this is good. So my previous responsibility with Microsoft before I retired is I was the chief operating officer for the US, and I ran the enterprise sector business, the large account business, a multi-billion-dollar business. And I religiously used zero-based budgeting. And I found it to be the best methodology for budgeting of the options that I had used over the years. And we could have a whole seminar just on this, right? Budgeting. But what I liked about this is that everybody had to justify their existence every year. And we had the fastest growing enterprise business in the industry at Microsoft as a result of doing things like this, where we had to go back and look at every single project. The hurdle I had at Microsoft was 10x. If you were going to get a part of the budget, you looked at strategic impact and you looked at the opportunity for risk and assessing risk, and then being in a situation where you had to get a 10x return. So I would recommend you consider this, and I'm happy to speak with anybody about this that wishes. I think it's a phenomenal tool. But in today's environment, where you have a lot of challenges with inflation and trying to manage the economics more acutely, this is a really important tool, because as I mentioned, you start with zero, you score the project based on risk, viability, return on investment, and the strategic impact of actually delivering the project. And then when someone is getting a piece of the budget because those criteria are met, then you're giving them, as I mentioned in Microsoft, a 10x return is required. In many cases, I see businesses anywhere from 5 to 10x. Then that becomes their personal performance review accountability, so that there's no slacking off between getting the budget and getting the result, and that's how they are evaluated in their review. I did this for everybody in the US subsidiary of Microsoft, and I found it to be extremely powerful because of the agility it created. I visited things every quarter to determine whether or not it was going to be something that would be sustained in terms of the projects that were in flight. And if they looked like they were trending properly, then we would keep investing in them. If they didn't, then we would just cut them and go to the next project on deck and put the new assumptions about the ROI in place. That allowed us to make sure we were optimizing for both revenue and expense at every step along the way. So while I don't run a nonprofit, I have run a nonprofit before, as mentioned in my bio. And I think this is a very important tool in today's economic environment. So I'll leave it with that. Holistic, I think you need to be transparent, by the way. And this, I was kind of shocked by somebody who told me the other day, well, I'm not going to tell you what our financial criteria are in our budget, one of the largest nonprofits in the US. And I said, it's important to share that because that becomes my responsibility. So you don't have to tell me, but I know I give a 3-to-1 payback at a minimum. But if you tell me there's some other metric and that's what the accountability is, at least I'll know whether I'm going to make your budget for funding. And I think getting people who can deliver the highest ROI with the most strategic impact are some of the most important fundamentals you can have in budgeting. So net, as we think about dealing with inflation, it's focusing on net proceeds, not revenue, sustaining donors over a lifetime of giving, personalizing the investment decisions on a monthly basis with direct response decisions, whether it's going to be in direct mail or email, and then finding new value in your lapse file, but doing it very precisely, and then making sure that over the course of time that you're in a situation where you're measuring fundraising performance in a method that is very equitable, like I've described, very accountable, like I've described, and that is shared with all stakeholders, and that there are people who perform against those standards. So I will leave it at that in terms of what we had to share today, but I'd be delighted to take questions.
Thank you very much, Michael and Rachel, for a very interesting presentation. And I'm going to try to consolidate these questions because it shows that there's a lot of interest in what you've had to say. One of them, and it is not unheard of since the pandemic, to see that acquisition costs have gone up to almost $3 for every dollar raised. So how do you justify the board to reducing your mail volume, which is almost counterintuitive, to focus on raising more money from less people without the certainty that you're going to be able to achieve the financial goals of the organization?
I think that's a really complex, brilliant question. So I really appreciate the quality of that question. The interesting thing about this is to start with a pilot. And so it's not about me asserting what we can do, what we have done. It's about you realizing it firsthand and taking that business case to the board. Most organizations I've dealt with have a part of their file they use for testing, and we do nothing dramatic with testing. We don't have people go sideways in terms of losing donors or losing a lot of money. We don't have that experience. So if you put us into the test file, you can do other types of testing. We don't monopolize that file. So if you want to test something, for instance, in the images that are used in solicitations or the nature of the appeal, if we are part of your testing process, we can actually show you how those monetize. And we can also show you in a controlled treatment basis who is responding to the direct response mail and who is not responding, and show you why the tools can retain the donors, retain the giving, and allow you to save the cost. And once you do that, and say it's 15% of your file, 20% of your file, it depends on a couple of factors. It depends on the size of the organization's solicitations, and it depends on the average gift amount, and it depends on the response rate. This is what determines how large the percentage of the renewal file should be. That's what normally we start with the renewal file. Once you have that business case, it's just presenting it, and then it proves itself or it doesn't. And nobody does something that doesn't prove itself.
So do you need a certain volume or gift size to use behavioral economics and AI? I mean, are there minimums or maximums?
There's no maximum. The technology is infinitely scalable. It's cloud services architecture, and it has no architectural limitations in the way it was designed. We take on very, very large clients with millions of solicitations at a time, and Rachel doesn't blink an eye. She just goes bang, 2 weeks later they're in production. On the lower end, it becomes an opportunity cost thing. Is it worth it your while to get somewhere between 4% and 27% more in giving? So for those who have the smaller files, like say they have a couple of thousand donors or a few thousand donors, if I use an example like Swarthmore College is a client of ours, the Albany Law School, they have a small number of donors, but very high gift amounts, $450. And they have very high participation rates or response rates between 40 and 60%. So for them, it was worth it to spend the money to do it and to get the benefits of the improvements in giving and retention that they've received from it. We have a process where we interview clients to do this, and we love, if I pick their random volume, if somebody's doing 100,000 solicitations a month in direct mail, and we take a pilot of 20,000, we put 20,000 in control, 20,000 in treatment, and then we see how that runs for a while. We do smaller ones than that, but that seems to be a really nice place to get started.
Okay, if you look at, if testing increases to the ask amount, what percentage in relationship to prior average gifts is the AI most often recommending? I mean, I'm wondering if there's a difference of 2 for low dollars versus mid-level versus high dollars.
Well, you're talking about right where Rachel has been living for the last year in terms of the update that she made to our technology last year. Do you want to talk about this a little bit, Rachel, please?
Sure. Yeah, I think when we think about how it affects the average gift, it's not precise, but I would think about it proportionally. So the percentage is generally consistent across the segments. It just means a lot more, like in the Swarthmore example that Michael gave earlier. So what we do on the lower end is try to balance that increase in giving, which 12% on $50 is not as much as 12% on $250. So on the lower end, it's really important for us to look at the cost benefit of exact donor as well and make sure that we're optimizing the net proceeds across all segments.
So we do know one thing I would compliment Rachel's point is below $50 this year, 2022 and part of 2021 as well, we have seen a lack of elasticity. I mentioned a couple of times. So I think Rachel's point is really astute, is don't stop working on the numerator, but make sure you get the gains out of not excessively soliciting. And then that's where you can get these $20 donors to have the right economic model for you.
I'd like to ask one last question, and that is, given your experience in the nonprofit sector, what are the biggest barriers to starting or continuing to use these capabilities?
I think the most important thing is that we're fighting inertia. And there are things, for instance, that are negotiated with marketing agencies that are done 18 to 24 months out, and then the contract is in place, after the planning process for additional 12 months or further. And the assumptions in those relationships sometimes don't provide space for this type of thing to be able to test. We do a brilliant job working with marketing agencies to complement the great work that they do by getting these ask amounts right. And so if we can work out a situation to do a pilot that demonstrates that, and that's where we spend a lot of our time, is making sure that we show the business cases and the examples and the case studies, which you can find on our junasolutions.com, and then using that rationale to allow us to break through and demonstrate some capabilities in the pilot. And then people are usually pretty friendly about bringing us in after that, because it's proof in the pudding.
There's somebody who's been raising their hands with a really interesting question, and it'll be our last one, unfortunately, because time is running out.
Yeah.
But given all the technology you've talked about, how important is creativity to this? Can a good creative writer influence these results, or is technology independent of anything except its own service to goals?
I got to tell you, I'm biased for good writers, and so I'm going to go with the writer is really critical. And I spent so much time on this. You can't make up for a bad appeal with a good estimate, right? So of the gift. So I say let's get the great writer. By the way, I'm looking for a great writer, so let me know who that is, please. But anyways, if you get a great appeal that emotionally connects, resonates with the donor and the right meaning to them, and it has the right kind of appeal and images in it, then it's almost like getting the icing on the cake. It's having that great carrot cake, and then having that nice cream cheese frosting on it, is we're just the frosting. We're going to take that appeal and bring it to its highest level of financial impact.
That's really great to know and encouraging to people who want to be very creative. So Michael and Rachel, thank you for a very informative session. You've covered a lot of ground and important ways for organizations to mitigate the cost of inflation, which are eating up their budgets. So thank you very much for spending time with us. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our session. You may hang up your headsets.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.